Declaration of Independence. Now, and was looked upon as madness. That's utter madness. How can these people do this? Who is this man Jefferson? So I can do nothing, and I agree. It's a problem. It's an intellectual problem that we're facing right now. I think it's a problem that comes from despair, from political rejection. I think it's because people don't feel much hope. My students don't feel much hope, frankly, for the way the world is. But I think that has a pattern. But I agree intellectually, it doesn't make sense as long as you don't go the other extreme. And I don't know, the 1776 project or what have you. I mean, this is part of the polarization. This is the part of the vital center coming undone. So that's what the argument is about. And if you try to make an argument other than that, you get misunderstood. But one thing I wanted to add, and just maybe I don't want to mess up the conversation, but let me add another concept from the Constitution that I think also has a history, and that's general welfare and the General Welfare Clause, right at the beginning, the preamble of the Constitution, because that involves a lot of the things that we've been talking about. To embrace a concept that there is such a thing as the general welfare, beyond having a military that's going to protect us from foreign invasion, et cetera, et cetera. No, there's something beyond that we do share in something. We may not share, we may have our localities, we have federalism. That's the genius of the Constitution, seems to me. And indeed, when the abolitionists got going, that was the clause they seized upon, even more than the Declaration at first. They seized upon the General Welfare Clause as a guarantee that black people should not be enslaved. That's what they believed. That's a very pregnant idea, the idea of the general welfare. And it's one, I think, that doesn't get examined enough in understanding what American history is about. That said,
that's so important that you put that on the table. I think your next book is about the evolution of understandings of equality in the anti-slavery.
Well, it's about the anti-slavery movement.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so important to invoke the preamble and to remind us that it was invoked in the 19th century. Melody Barnes, I think let's keep on equality until we want to move to liberty. But you talked about justice as a twin to equality. Does the general welfare count too? And what are your thoughts on, Shauna says that there is a vital center that embraces the ideals of the Declaration still as extremists reject it. Do you agree or not?
I absolutely do. And I think that there's a tradition, and a tradition that exists in the African-American community for that.
Absolutely.
In fact, we recently at UVA had Melvin Rogers come and speak about his important new book, The Dark and Light of Faith. And in fact, I know that he was also a guest with Jamel, who I don't know if he's here yet, at the National Constitution Center, talking about these 19th century Black intellectuals who thought about and had faith in the American idea, even when evidence didn't necessarily say that you should have faith in the American idea. They were racing ahead to what they believed to be the fulfillment of the aspiration of that idea. And you see it in Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells and David Walker. I mean, and the list goes on. So I think we can pull that tradition through, and it exists today. I mean, you speak of the views of as an immigrant, and I think about this as the embodiment of so many different traditions. Immigrant, ancestors who were slaves, ancestors who were indigenous people, and what all of that means as we do this work in democracy and think about and focus on and believe in the idea of justice. And the work that we do at the University of Virginia as I lead my team is that our objective is to close the delta between reality and the aspiration. It is an ongoing journey and an ongoing project, and it is exemplified in the expansion of justice that we have seen across American history. I think the frustration comes when, after one lesson after another, a war gets fought, 600,000 people die, the list goes on and on. when it feels like we've taken 2 steps forward, but we've taken another step back. And I think that's where people become very deeply frustrated and angry, and you see that in the literature well into the 20th century as well. So I believe that to be true. I mean, I also want to go back, and we should probably have coffee or a drink or something later, and talk about, this idea of federalism and what I meant when I talked about the abstraction. I mean, as someone who's written about community wealth building and the idea of a local focus of the expansion of wealth for those who have not had access to opportunity and the social and economic conditions that make democracy possible, I believe that there's an important place for the local. But I do that and say that without eschewing the importance of the federal, because otherwise I feel like there's a great big notwithstanding clause when you look at the progress that's been made over the course of the 20th century to where we are today that absolutely requires the federal government to be involved and to enforce and to make that real as a blanket of the expression of the rights and responsibilities that people have as citizens in the United States.
Wow, the experience with the community welfare programs is such a powerful example. And that program with Jamel Bouie that you mentioned about the Black intellectual tradition and abolitionists who invoked the Declaration and defended the American idea to expand rights was riveting. And the precision of the legal arguments that people made, that Black people made to demand that the Declaration's promise be fulfilled is really exciting. So that's an important way of telling the story historically. Let's put on the table liberty. And the first liberty that Jefferson believed was the first of our unalienable rights was liberty of conscience, freedom to think as you will and speak as you think, because we can't command ourselves or anyone else to think as we please. We're creatures of reason, and the mind must be free, the illimitable freedom of the human mind. At the same time, Jefferson and Hamilton disagreed about how to protect freedom, and Jefferson thought every increase in power threatened liberty, and Hamilton thought that increases in state power could promote liberty. How would you introduce liberty, Charlie Cook, and what stories would you want to tell?
Well, the first thing I would say is often Americans don't appreciate the extent to which they are freer than everyone else. And they ought to know that, and they ought to wake up every morning and kiss the carpet or whatever they have on the floor of their house. I, again, would add the caveat that this has not always been equally applied to everyone. But now we live in a system that has so many of the virtues of 18th century classical liberalism and a equality of liberty that is to be envied. And I think this is an astonishing thing. Now, I by no means came from a tyranny. I came from England. It's a very nice country. But it is a lot less free than the United States in lots of important ways. I mean, it's less economically free. We can argue about the politics of that. I'm a conservative. Not everyone here is. That's fine. But we probably agree on most of the other freedoms. The First Amendment is an outlier in the world, and a virtuous outlier in the world. And it is an expression of freedom of conscience that my friends back home, even if I agree with them on most things, often think is crazy. They will say to me, how is it that some crazy Florida pastor can burn a Quran and not be arrested? How is it that you allow people who hate the country to talk about having a revolution or starting a civil war? If you look at the seminal and the controlling Supreme Court case on freedom of expression, Brandenburg v. Ohio, the people who were in the government's target in that case are absolutely awful. I mean, they are the worst people in the world. They stood up on that stage, they were armed, and they used the N-word. Every Jewish stereotype and slur you can think of. They promised revengeance. You know, they praised the Klan, and they still weren't sent to prison. And you know, this is a beautiful, beautiful thing, because what the decision determined was that you can never tell who's going to be the person on the stage. If you go back through the early Republic, what you'll find is that most of the free speech laws actually get enforced against abolitionists. You know, there's a gag rule in Congress. In the states, you're not allowed to advocate against slavery. The federal government and the southern states, to put it lightly, were not friendly towards the civil rights activists in the 1950s and 60s. And this decision has this wonderful abstract principle, this neutral principle in it, which says, yeah, these people are awful, but we don't want to set that precedent. Well, where I'm from, again, great country, not a tyranny by any stretch of the imagination, but that is just not the law. In England is an equal opportunity censor. The Muslims go to jail for criticizing the Christians, and the Christians go to jail for criticizing the Muslims, and the atheists go to jail for criticizing both of them. And on and on and on. We have people being arrested outside of abortion clinics for praying. So, you know, this country has maintained these ideas that came over the Atlantic from England, Scotland. Much as it pains me to say it's an Englishman, but Scotland was a key part of the Enlightenment. And they got set down in aspic, and they got pushed into the culture as well. And when James Madison introduces the Bill of Rights, which of course he didn't want because he thought the enumerated powers doctrine would be enough, but he says that this is a great document because it will help instill in the hearts of the people a respect for these rights. And it did. And that's still here in a way that we don't have anywhere else in the world. And I just think this is a beautiful thing that has stayed with this country and that has made it what it is.
Amen. Amen. It is a beautiful thing. And it is important to tell the story of how that shining principle in the Brandenburg case, that speech can only be banned if it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. The principle that was at stake in the Supreme Court oral argument this morning about whether or not President Trump engaged in insurrection makes America a glorious global outlier, the most speech-protective country in the world, a crown jewel of our democratic tradition, and that ideal which came from Tacitus and Milton and Cato's letters and Spinoza and was inscribed by Jefferson into the Virginia Declaration of Religious Freedom and then by Louis Brandeis into the U.S. reports, makes America an inspiration, beacon of freedom. Sean, isn't that right?
Correct.
I think for fun you should have said nope.
Yeah, right. You crazy?
Absolutely.
Well, one thing that strikes me, and Charlie was talking, I mean, America began not only in the Enlightenment, which is actually in certain precincts in rather bad odor these days, which it oughtn't to be. I mean, we began with the Enlightenment, and we began as an anti-monarchical society. Those are the two intellectual prisms of all the people we're talking about. And I think that a lot of what we're all praising up here stems from those two things. And it's only by refreshing our appreciation of those two things that we're going to be able, I think, to revivify our civic culture. Without them, we're dead. And the Enlightenment is not just about reason. It's a much deeper thing than all of that. But it certainly strikes on the liberties that we were talking about in all of those ways. So yes, you were giving a reading list to the crowd.
Yes.
Spinoza and on through.
Absolutely.
Those are crucial texts that are living, that are very much alive, and that I commend to everyone. Many of the black intellectuals, by the way, I've just been reading about this, were actually very deeply involved in all of that stuff, reading all of that stuff. The Romantics as well, but a lot of the Enlightenment people too. That it has many inflections. There's no one Enlightenment, but without it, I think the American experiment is sunk. And as for the anti-monarchical stuff, well, we forget. We forget what the world was like in 1776. We forget even when Lincoln is talking in the 1860s about secession and the country falling apart, He said, you know, we are the one best hope of mankind because we're the only democratic republic in the world.